Okay, so as a kind of an example of this kind of philosophical or epistemological um, entry into critical discourse or critical analysis of psychology, we're kind of picking up with some of the readings. And I think the first distinction I want to make is when we look at this slide here, is the distinction that Graham Richards makes between capital P and small p psychology. And I think this is a really useful distinction for us to look at and think about. Um, in his scheme, capital P psychology refers to the field or the discipline of psychology. It's what you're majoring in, right? That starts in 1879, supposedly. That's at least the origin story. And then from there you have the practice and study of psychology that follows. Small p psychology, on the other hand, is more referring to the subject matter, not so much the discipline. Small p psychology would go back, you can imagine the history of this going all the way back to, as soon as we started wondering about our own motivations and our own why we do what we do. It's the way we kind of talk about ourselves, the way we look at ourselves, the language we use to talk about ourselves. And we've been doing that, of course, as I said, since the beginning of recorded history is an account of that. So the relationship between these two things, small p psychology is, of course, Hermann von Ebbinghaus has this famous quote where he says, psychology has a short past but a long history, or a long history and a short past. Or it's meant to point out the fact that the discipline of psychology has been around only a short time, but the discourse of psychological has been around a very long time. Now, when we look at this circle of that I have here on the screen of praxis, social context, and historical context, I want to talk about it in terms of both capital P and small p psychology. So let's look at it in terms of capital P psychology first. Okay, so when we talk about capital P psychology, we're looking at discipline, and the term praxis. It's a pretentious sounding word. All it means is language and practice. It's like different forms of practice, like psychotherapy, and praxis also like language, like using terms like depression or anxiety within the context of something like psychotherapy. So it's sort of what you do, right, and what you say. And when we look at capital P psychology, when we talk about that, when we talk about, well, what does psychology do? What does it say? What's its language? What are its practices? What are its products? What is it, about? You'd have to, of course, know, well, which psychology are you talking about? Are you talking about North American psychology? Are you talking about Japanese psychology? Are you talking about British psychology? You have to have some kind of social context there, right? We often don't really think about that, but you would have to have you'd have to know what kind of society, what kind of culture are you referring to when you talk about, do they even have a discipline of psychology, right? Also, at the same time, you would not only need to know that, you would also need to know when. So you need to know the place of the praxis and also the when of the praxis, which is the historical context. We'd say, well, I'm talking about North American psychology. Okay, well, when was it? North American psychology looks very different in 1900 as opposed to 2000, right? So you would have to have some sort of place and time, essentially, for praxis. Okay, so different practices, different language, different meanings. They all have a certain cultural and social context, and they also have a historical context. You need to know all of those things if you're going to talk about capital P psychology. Okay, now let's look at small p psychology, right? Same thing. You ask, if we wanted to find out, well, what is depression? right? Well, then we realized that the term depression really only started going in the 20th century, even really the later half of the 20th century after World War II, right, in North America, right? So then we start locating the term within some kind of social context and some kind of historical context. Okay, depression, at least the term itself, does not have that long of a history. There are other terms like melancholia that have a much longer sort of history. They go all the way back into Europe and so forth, right? So that's that's what we mean when we talk about small p psychologies. What is the language of the psychological? We do the same thing with regard to practices like psychotherapy. You know, there were a number of different psychotherapies in the early 20th century. There were a number of different, even before it was even called psychotherapy. You know, how did it originate? What was the social context? What was the historical context? You get the idea, hopefully, right? That anytime you're talking about psychological terms, concepts, practices, beliefs, right, you're having to locate it in some kind of historical and social context to make sense out of that. And I think that's something that, by and large, the psychology that you're learning can often be taken out of context. It's not treated in any kind of context. It's just treated as universals, right? And I think there are a lot of problems with that. I think and that's one of the first things we're going to be sort of critiquing and looking at is that question. Why don't we talk about context more? And isn't it strange? And there's really, so much historical and social context to examine with psychology, because we are studying ourselves and making up a language to do that. Obviously, context is important. Okay, let's move on to two people that also kind of get us into this, into the, some basic discussions about the philosophical and epistemological basis of psychology's philosophy of science. And that it's a bit of a warhorse an old warhorse in the philosophy of science circles, and that's the Popper-Kuhn debate, right? These are two people that you should definitely know a bit more, about, or know something about, and maybe you already do, but maybe know a little bit more about things like falsifiability and what it really means, and what Popper actually thought, how it should be applied, and so forth. So let's get into that just for a moment, because I'm sure you probably have heard of the term falsifiability as sort of what defines a scientific theory from a non-scientific theory and so forth. Okay. Well, Karl Popper, Sir Karl Popper, right, was a philosopher of science and was working on how do we detect, or how do we distinguish a scientific theory from a non-scientific theory. And he was a very good historian as well. And he noted that it is very difficult, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, to prove a theory. I'm not talking just about science. He's talking about science in general, right? Not about psychology. But any science, it's very difficult to prove a theory. You have to eliminate all of the possible alternatives. And in practice, it's very difficult to do that. You don't even know what all the alternatives might be, right? This is part of what he called the problem of induction, that you can kind of keep gathering, evidence. And really what we end up doing in psychology and most sciences, we're looking for systemic observations or systemic patterns, and trying to make predictions based on models that we have, the best evidence that we have. It's very difficult to say this is the only collection, or the only way that this makes sense, that no other interpretation of the data would be possible, that you've eliminated, any other possible interpretation of the data. That's really very difficult to do. So he notes this historically as a situation, the problem of induction, so-called. And he says what we should really do then is sort of work backwards, right, and think about falsification. That is, can the theory possibly be wrong, right? Can we set up a case? Can it make a prediction, even kind of a risky prediction, that could refute it? Because if you can say, well, pretty much this is why you critique psychoanalysis, you can pretty much predict anything. And which is kind of a false critique, because psychoanalysis never even assumed to be this kind of scientific theory. That was not the model of science it was working from in the first place. So quite naturally, it didn't live up to that. But anyway, this was his example, right, of falsification. That it should make predictions that could turn out to be wrong, and if it does that, then it could be considered a scientific theory. And he actually believes that in practice, probably all of our theories, all of our predictions will be overturned, or all of our hypotheses will be overturned, and that we'll continue to just, kind of not necessarily prove which theory is right, but reject different kind of pieces of the puzzle, and kind of by reverse direction sort of narrow down the range of possible explanations. Maybe not settling on one, but continue to kind of whittle away at the things that are wrong or incorrect, and get rid of those. Right? Was basically the idea Popper was suggesting. So he believes that really science rests on being able to make predictions, build workable models and theories, and that science should be theory driven, right? That it should work from a theoretical framework, it should make predictions. And what you should not do, and unfortunately this is what a lot of people in psychology do, it should not just be a simple empirical inductive search for regularities, right? Where you're just not so much really working from a theoretical framework or trying to build a theory, but you're just looking to reject the null hypothesis and get a publication, right? And this is honestly, this is what you see a lot in the field. It's not really driven by a theoretical model so much as looking for practical applications of a particular set of concepts, or make predictions. And we don't have this feeling in the field that we're necessarily building towards refining theoretical models so much, or refining theory so much as this kind of search for empirical regularities. This is why the null hypothesis testing is such a widely used tool. On the other side, we have Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn, just a little bit after Popper, historically publishes The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962, right? Says that science and all knowledge is bound by paradigms. And this term paradigms is very, very frequently used, probably just as much as falsification. And like any time something becomes really frequently used, it becomes distorted with so much use. Paradigms, according to Kuhn, as it was originally meant, is a framework of knowledge or knowing. It's very broad. It's much broader than a theory. It's just a kind of a general kind of perspective that you would have, right? And he says that when you look at the history of physics, this is what his book is about. You can see it moving through different paradigms, and he gives the example of these three stages, and he gives some examples. So what he calls the pre-paradigmatic or pre-scientific stage is what you had before, let's say, going back to the Middle Ages, right, where there was really no systematic understanding about the world, about how there was no theory of universal gravitation, for instance. Before Newton, there were just there was really kind of more of a religious sort of Aristotelian or scholastic explanation of the world. And with people like Galileo, and then of course Newton, Kepler, the new physicists as they emerged, this brought about what he calls a paradigmatic structure, where you had, especially Newton, you had kind of a structure now for understanding the motion of bodies and how things sort of worked, right, from a natural holistic explanation. this pretty much reigned supreme until the early 20th century, when you had people like Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr propose relativity and quantum mechanics, respectively. Each of those two theories could not fit within the paradigm, the Newtonian paradigm. They proposed things and made predictions that went against what you would expect with Newton. Right, that time was relative, motion is relative, and so forth. That uncertainty is woven into the fabric of the universe, as Niels Bohr would and Heisenberg would discover with quantum mechanics. And so this produces a paradigm shift, because you have a break in the old paradigm, and then you have hopefully new paradigm or new paradigms that emerge. And Kuhn's point in all this is that all of our observations, all of the what we think of as, just normal kind of objective scientific observations, are theory laden. That you cannot simply go out and make an observation without attaching the meaning of that observation to some kind of theoretical framework, right? Some kind of paradigm, right? All of these observations happen within paradigms, and is to a certain extent defined by this context of that paradigm. So this becomes a really fundamental way of thinking about science, that you, in some way, it all really is very contextual, right? I mean, you can make really good predictions, you can do a lot of good work, but Kuhn's saying ultimately that it's all sort of set within this larger framework, and that larger framework eventually is going to be changed, that there's going to be some kind of revolution, and that it's going to evolve. He doesn't believe that there's any kind of linear direction to these things, right? It's not as if paradigms are moving towards some grand paradigm. No, he thinks it's much more subtle than that. It's much more nuanced than that. That the scientific paradigms are actually part of a larger cultural system of understanding that happens and that changes as well. So science is actually an extension of larger kind of cultural paradigms or frameworks or ways of thinking that are not linear in any sort of way. He also says the paradigms are incommensurable, meaning you can't evaluate a theory outside of a paradigm. There's no, kind of God's eye point of view, or right super objective or superordinate point of view to look at paradigms and evaluate them. You can't really escape that paradigm, right? There's no kind of outside to that. So truth then becomes somewhat of a little bit of a smaller term. That science doesn't really deal with universal objective forever and ever amen certainty, right? Scientific truth is ultimately, kind of a contextual truth. It may work objectively for us. The universal law of gravitation for Newton, is going to work for pretty much everyone on the planet, right? We can consider it to be capital T objective truth, because we don't experience things. Our mass hopefully does not become so heavy that we begin to distort time or space, right? But if we want to understand, like, communication satellites, and if we look at the communication satellites we have in our planet, for instance, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but because I do love this stuff, but we use quantum mechanics all the time, because the way time passes here on Earth and the way time passes in space with our tracking satellites and communication satellites is different, because the mass of the Earth affects the flow of time on Earth as opposed to out in space. So there, it actually does make a difference. But on a practical level, and that's what most of us are concerned about, of course, in the way we think, I guess, these kinds of distinctions don't show up. And you could live your entire life, right? And people did for centuries and centuries and centuries, and never realize, and never have to, come to terms or be confronted with that fact. But as we have progressed through and developed different kinds of technologies, these things are starting to be revealed, and we need new paradigms in order to in order to cope with them. Okay, so that's pretty much just a kind of a look at a couple of the kind of philosophical this kind of perspectives that a couple of these are mentioned in your book. And when I get back in town, we will have kind of a discussion about these things, and I'll be looking forward to hearing what you think, and kind of get back to what this course is supposed to be about, which is really sharing our understandings and kind of our progress, I guess, to use that word somewhat paradoxically, in dealing with these questions.